All right. Well, thank you, Yuki, for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Today, super excited to introduce Yuki, who is a prolific product leader. Many of you have probably heard about him or seen him speak. He's a CPO at Figma. He started his career at Microsoft and Google, working on such household name products, beloved household name products like Hotmail.
I know that, beloved.
Yeah, I inserted that there for good measure. And YouTube. And then from Google, he went to Uber, where we overlapped and had many, many great late-night chats. We actually used to walk home from work together and debrief different product aspects. And ran the rider and driver team, so two of the biggest teams at Uber Yuki was responsible for, and during that time ran massive redesigns of the whole app. So a lot to dig into there. And then after Uber, he went to Figma, where he's been for the last 6-ish years now, running design, product, taking Figma through almost acquisition, and then eventually IPO. Wild roller coaster ride, but an incredibly amazing run there. So super excited to have you here today.
Thank you.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about two things that you don't often see hand in hand, which are data and design. And so you might be wondering why we have a design leader up on stage with us today, but I think it's really important to incorporate this aspect of product development into the conversation because it's a huge force, right? I'll start with a little story. So we used to joke that we were the yin and yang of product because Yuki is a core experience PM at heart. I don't know if you've ever run an experiment in your life. And I'm like a growth gal, right? I was always on the growth team. I was always coming in and ruining the core experience. And Yuki was coming to my desk and being like, what is going on here? And I'm like, but the business and growth. So I always feel like we've always kind of had that healthy tension. I don't know if you remember those days.
Yeah, definitely. That's not an incorrect characterization. But for the record, I did run a very big experiment at Uber, or tried to, at least. We were doing a big redesign of the rider app way back when, and for those of you who may not have either been around or don't remember those days, Uber used to work more like a taxi. You went in the car, and then once you got out, that's when you knew how much you paid. We were trying to do a big redesign to make sure that we get the destination from the rider up front, so that then they get the price up front and know going in exactly how much they're going to pay. And that was this big rider app redesign, which we called Helix at the time. And one of the big questions we had was, it's such a foundational change to the way we work. How do we know that this is the right thing? And how do we actually roll this out in a responsible way? Especially on the iOS app, where at the time the Apple Store didn't actually have capabilities like staged rollup.
Mm-hmm.
Travis, the CEO at the time, and I actually went down to Apple to beg them for this capability, and they didn't deliver. And so we were in a meeting where we're like, what are our options, right? And our option number one, we go Android first. Android can do rollout first, and Travis didn't like that because, iOS is also important. And, in terms of especially kind of the zeitgeist and designers, they're really excited about the iOS app.
Yep.
Option number two was two binaries in one. We had the Swift binary that had the new app, and then the Objective-C binary, and that was the old app. And we wanted to do a little client-side, hash to randomly put people in it. But the problem was that would make the binary so big that it couldn't be downloadable without Wi-Fi. And then option number three, which I named, was the YOLO option, which was just do it, and then we'll measure it in pre-post.
Oh, we measured it.
Yeah, you guys measured it, and so we went with the last option, obviously, but the way we approached it was obviously looking at the metrics, but also using Android to understand and debug some issues. So that was my one big experiment at Uber.
Well, I'll provide the post analysis of that. So we did measure it, and it was a huge design moment, big launch, beautiful app, and it performed great in a lot of regions. But the regions that I was responsible for at the time, India and Southeast Asia, it was terrible for metrics, terrible. The business was in a really bad spot with this new app. And we realized it was actually the crux of the redesign, the where to. It required you to input a destination up front. And at the time, I think this was 2016, and in India, like Google Maps in 2016 was not great. And so you could never actually find the destination you were looking for. It wouldn't snap to a real location. And then people just got frustrated and rage quit the app and went to the competitor. So that's what happens when you do the YOLO option. But you know, in hindsight, it was actually good, and we worked through those issues. But it does speak to the power of like incrementally changing things, and we could have used our existing app and tested where to, and quickly realized that that wouldn't have worked before redesigning the whole app around it. So I do, you know, jokes aside, that was a fun era. I want to touch a little bit on how you're, you know, thinking of decision making, using data, quantitative versus qualitative inputs, how that has evolved over time, you know, especially across different companies with different data cultures, right? Google's famous for being very data driven. And then, you know, Uber was incredibly data driven in some aspects, less so in others. And now at Figma, which is a design company.
Yeah. You know, it's kind of related to the story we started with, but, you know, a lot of my career, I have been working in more data-driven cultures like YouTube, like Uber, and they're so data-driven to the extent that they have their own Statsigs internally, and maybe that's changed since, and hopefully you've won some of them over.
Not at Google or
All right,
Uber
well,
yet.
we got to work on that
Next
then.
on our list.
But you know, they had their respective internal platforms, and that was how much they cared about data. And you know, one of the struggles I had, especially as someone who was the caretaker of the core experience, was like, you know, how do I set good metrics? How do I set good OKRs? And you know, the thought chain that you usually have is, okay, well, I'm the core experience person. I'm responsible for, you know, our users being happy and engaged in using our product. And so, you know, maybe I start with something that's kind of captures that, like, you know, NPS or App Store ratings or things like that. And, you know, those are, you know, good metrics, but they don't really, it's hard to prove incrementality. Once you like measure these, you know, and you realize something's going wrong, they're very difficult to use to debug, right? And so like your next chain of thought might be, okay, well actually, like, should I be going for, you know, something more closer to the business that the business actually cares about? So in the case of, you know, YouTube, it might have been like watch time, right? Or in the case of Uber, it might be number of trips. And, you know, as you start going down that route, you know, as a core experience PM, you start wondering, okay, well, I want to make this experience really great for people, and the car selection experience, or like the play pause button, or whatever that, you know, scrubbing in the video. And it's very hard to prove that that moves those bigger metrics, right? And many leaps of faith. And you kind of get into this existential problem of like, well, if I'm trying to move a bigger metric like trips or even retention, like, you know, I should be doing what the growth team is doing. And, you know, like, but we're not a growth team. And so that gets confusing really quickly. And so usually what ends up happening is, you know, you settle on these like secondary metrics, you know, these metrics that kind of are measurable, that show kind of like movement towards what you might want. But it's still a little bit like people don't believe them deeply, right? Like if you ask an average engineer in the hallway, like, you know, do you know about this metric? Do you care about it? They won't. It's one of those metrics that you set, and then at the end of the quarter, you kind of cross your fingers and hope that it moved, you know? But it's really just kind of a performative exercise. And so that was like a lot of like, okay, well, how do we actually like find the right metrics? How do we actually make decisions, you know, based on that? And there's a lot of struggle, I would say, in the early days, you know, of my career thinking about that. And in fact, when I first arrived at Figma, I arrived to a bunch of these kinds of secondary metrics, right? Things like teams would say, hey, like, I really want to increase the percentage of people in a company who use design systems or something like that, which, you know, is probably a good thing to measure, but at the same time, like, it's not the metric that people are thinking about every single day. And it's also not necessarily something we've proven is actually important for a business per se. And there are a lot of these tiny secondary metrics to the point where it was very hard to understand what a team was even trying to do. And so the first thing I actually did was deprecate OKRs.
Ooh, spicy.
Yeah, and say, hey, like, I just want to know what like headline like you're trying to go for. Like at the end of the quarter, like what are you trying to like, what do you want to be able to say that you accomplished? Just so that I even know like where you're headed. And I want us to assign like a letter grade, right? And in that letter grade, it's like, there's qualitative inputs, there are quantitative inputs, and some of those inputs may change over time as our ability to measure those things get more sophisticated, but at least that gets us on the same page. And that's not to dismiss the importance of metrics. Metrics are really important to kind of sharpen our understanding of it, and it might be that, you know, some of what we graded was wrong, and we can go back and do that. But I think one of the things that kind of I learned out of this process was, the power of metrics is not just that you have this singular thing that you're going for. Sometimes that could be wrong, but rather the rituals that you have around it. Like the idea that we're coming back every quarter or every cadence to kind of grade, look at those metrics, and have that discussion. That's what was really important. And the other lesson was really that like it still is important to keep tabs on metrics like NPS and other things that are fuzzier metrics. They're low fidelity, but it still keeps you honest. And you just have to change your expectations around what they are able to do as it relates to kind of like explaining everything.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's pretty bold to come into a new company and immediately deprecate OKRs. I'm curious, you worked very closely with Dylan. How did he feel about that? How does he interact with data? Like, at a leadership team level, were you super aligned that this was the right thing, or was this kind of a Yuki-driven initiative that you had to push back on?
Well, I mean, the reality is teams still had goals of sorts, right? And there was a headline, and the goals are associated with that headline. So, you can argue that there was a form of OKR there, but I think what the culture I wanted to remove was like this list of secondary metrics that no one actually cared about, but was very performative. And then I think over time, we found a data science leader, Annie, who you and I both worked with, and that changed the culture too in terms of like higher quality goals and metrics that mattered, or more investment into deciding, there's a whole roadmap of actually even developing metrics in the first place, right? Yep. And so, that's changed over time. But I think as it relates to Dylan, a lot of the way Dylan works is he's definitely an intuition-driven person, but some of the intuition comes from the fact that he is the person in the company that reads the most customer feedback out of any of us. And it has been doing that for over a decade. And that has somehow processed into an intuition where he can look at a feature and tell you that it probably won't work, or that like it won't land in a particular way. That being said, though, like, one of the ways he engages with metrics is, when it challenges his intuitions, he really engages you in a debate around it. He's like, first of all, is that metric measuring even the right thing? And like, let's get into it. And if it is, how do you actually turn that also into an intuition where you actually intuitively understand what's happening on the ground to know why this metric is working in that way it is? And I think that part is really important, where I think, a lot of us, especially who are embedded in the design world, we want like a human level understanding of like what's happening, right? Like if this metric is moving, like what is causing a user to like ignore this or click this instead? And can we understand that even at like the session level? So, like I love things like session replays, or, just like using a metric to then like go and talk to a bunch of users who have behaved in a certain way, like actually talk to them and have them share screen. And I think that's what helps you build intuition. And so to him, it comes back to intuition, but like the metrics are a big part of that.
That's super interesting. I love that you call out, Dylan's maniacal focus on support in the customer, because you guys are actually very famous for having a really huge, beloved community who's vocal and a huge part of your product development process. I'm curious, that is another source of data. How do you mine both quantitative and qualitative insights from your community and harness that in road mapping, for example?
Yeah. Well, there's a few thoughts we have about this. And obviously, every company is told that talking to your customers is important. And in fact, many of them do, right? And, Uber, that was one of our cultural values too, like customer obsession, right?
Obsession.
Yes, obsession. And it was true. There was a lot of talking with customers. And a few things come to mind. The first is like really just making sure that like we, it's very easy to just listen to customers who are very vocal and active, and we have to create the space to go find customers who may not have the ability to express what they their own frustrations, or even realize in some cases there are many customers who experience things and don't realize that it's not their problem, it's our problem, and things like that. So I think just being thoughtful about that is one big thing. But more importantly, one of our cultural values is building community. And as part of that, it's really about building relationships with customers such that, you could just DM or text your customer and be like, hey, what do you think of this? And really get an honest response. And for us, the thought experiment is like, okay, how do we actually build relationships deep enough that they will actually feel comfortable giving you direct feedback or give you feedback proactively? And that's what we really kind of strive for when we think about customer feedback, because I think it's that trust that is really gonna like help. And I think for that reason, oftentimes when, for example, if the sales team asks me to go into a customer conversation, I'm very conscious of like, I'm not gonna go in and like go pitch a product. I want to come here with like, hey, I'm actually here just to learn from you. And if the outcome of that is this product isn't right for you, I would rather know that than to push this product upon you. And like, those are the kind of relationships I think is really important to cultivate.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that. I think trust is huge. We might have the opposite problem. We have deep kind of individual customer level Slack channels with each customer, and there's constant back and forth product feedback. It's awesome. It's like a huge mine of insights. But there's so much trust that sometimes I think people are like, this sucks, we hate this, da da da. But that's actually really good. You want that, and I love that we have that space where people feel like they actually can be really raw and vocal, and not sugarcoat things. And what's cool about these Slack channels and now with all these AI Slack automations is that you can pull insights at a data level out as well. I can look at which topics and which surfaces in the product are coming up the most because, we're just cataloging all that data and AI is pulling insights from that.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that Dylan likes to do too is just like, read these Slack channels and just like have an ambient awareness of like the vibes around here. Yeah, just like a pulse. And I think that's also important.
Yeah.
Like I think it's one thing to be like, have this very clear question in your head and go to a dashboard and see what's happening.
Yep.
And it's another to just kind of have this like awareness. And I think that's important too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because you can look at the aggregate numbers and you lose the tone of the individual message. Hey, this person's frustrated. Hey, this person's hitting a wall. Or hey, this person's really happy and excited, but they didn't use 10 exclamation points. So I do think there's a lot there. So speaking of AI, I do want to pivot a bit because you guys at Figma just launched this amazing report. If folks in the audience haven't read it, it's actually a good read. It's talking about kind of the future of AI in design. It's beautifully designed. It's a beautiful document. And one tidbit that I really enjoyed was they reported that executives specifically are feeling the impact of AI more than any other role, with close to 40% of executives saying AI has already had significant to transformational impact over the last 12 months. So you're an executive. I'm curious if this maps to your day-to-day. And if so, like, how does this show up? And then conversely, how does it show up on your teams?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, for me, I both feel it, but also don't feel it. The ways I feel it is, certainly when you look at like Figma or even the customers that we talk to, there are people who, a lot of the developers are now, using coding assistants, right? And surely there's time savings there. And, for many of them who are kind of interacting with designers are now really excited about our MCP server so that they can use it to extract content out of Figma, but stay in their IDE while doing that. And so, that seems transformative from a workflow perspective. We now see a lot of people prototyping, right? And, one of the things that kind of I like to say now is that wireframes are dead. This idea that like you have a low fidelity kind of idea that you're expressing, it made sense in the past, right? Because taking things to high fidelity took a lot of time. And if it takes time, you get into the sunk cost fallacy, and like you end up not exploring other ideas. But now you can explore multiple ideas at high fidelity and not have strong feelings about, okay, we're going to throw it out and move on to the next idea. And I think that's really powerful. And we're seeing more kinds of roles actually just reaching for prototypes. And I think what's really transformational about that is not just kind of the fact that a picture is worth 1,000 words and prototypes are worth like 1,000x that, but the fact that kind of there's this empowerment that exists now, right? Like especially as as a product manager, maybe you needed to wait for a designer to be able to prototype something in the past, or an engineer, or in a realm that's maybe not like prototyping, like you need a data scientist to like write a query for you potentially, and now it's a little bit like we all need to unlearn our learned helplessness in some sense, right? And you can like reach for tools and like AI, and it's going to help you get somewhere, right? And unblock yourself in some meaningful way, even if it's not all the way there. And I think that's transformative. And the reasons we build products like the MCP server or Figma Make are to kind of align with some of those trends. On the other hand, though, the reason I say well, sometimes I don't I don't see it is, I talk to a lot of leaders, and there's a little bit of this kind of I would almost say kind of not fear mongering, but this idea that everyone is saying AI is transforming the way they work, right? And then you're kind of looking at your own team and saying, okay, is it transforming it that much though, right? And for example, I was talking to the CPO of a large company last week, and he was talking about how he was talking to one of his PMs who was excited about how he was writing PRDs with ChatGPT. It's like, okay, show me, and it's like a prompt and a big PRD spits out, and the CPO is like, wow, this is garbage. It's like it's not nuanced. I'm sure it's like a reasonable first draft, but it's hard to believe that the future of product development is one in which you have a small idea and it gets turned into text by an AI, and that's that. But there are small parts that were really interesting, like, for example, the insights part of the PRD and how it synthesized a bunch of data that you otherwise would not have read. That's super useful, right? Or maybe there are cases where you send a PRD to an AI assistant and it kind of analyzes it for holes. That could be interesting. And so I think there are these pockets right now of usefulness. And I'm really hopeful that all of us could share that with with each other, because I think that's the starting point. And I'm sure all of this evolves over time, but right now I think there's a little bit of this performative AI in a sense, right? Of we're saying we're doing AI and showing these kind of cherry picking these particular examples. And that's kind of creating noise and not allowing us to see some of these truly useful use cases that might not be immediately transformative as much, but are truly useful.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's each phase of product development, within that phase, there's AI tooling that can help a ton. So prototyping, instead of having to write up a huge PRD and explain it with words, you can just create a visual, and that's a huge time saver. Or code can get written faster with AI coding assistants. But then the end-to-end still requires a human to actually stitch it together and orchestrate and have the nuance and the context of how these pieces fit together. Super interesting. I actually want to double click on fear, because fear, this doesn't get talked about a lot because I don't think anyone wants to admit they're scared, but you're right. It is there's a lot of fear mongering going on. And I'm curious, let me just turn the lights on. Perfect. We don't need to live in fear anymore. I'm curious, there's a fear that AI will eliminate roles entirely, and design has come up in this conversation. How are you thinking about that at Figma? You have a design-led culture. You are for designers. How do you keep this fear at bay?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a few ways that I think about it. The lights have come down, so the fear is back. Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways I think about it. The first is, I actually think that we have proven over time that bringing more people into the design process just makes for better products, right? And actually, increases the contribution of a designer who knows how to navigate that space. And for example, with AI makes everyone better at writing, right? But it doesn't mean that everyone is now a professional writer, right? But I think the important thing is really, for me, I like to talk about kind of what it means to be a designer. Right? It's really easy to kind of think about it as you're pushing pixels and doing layouts. But at the end of the day, I think about it as you're problem solving, right? You're pushing the status quo. You're obsessing over details and pushing, and that's what makes a great designer amazing. And those are the attributes that are actually more important than ever before. And so the kind of nature of the designer job could change a little bit in terms of the portfolio of work you do, and some of the kind of tasks around creating pushing pixels, if you will, might get reduced and automated. And that's actually a great thing because they can focus on some of these bigger problems. And the reality of AI today, when you think about kind of all of these AI tools, is it creates something that is good enough, right? But I think everyone now has access to that, and that's a wonderful thing for the world. But good enough is the new mediocre, right? And so, in that world, who are the people who are going to push for more and greater, right? Who's going to like keep prompting, keep designing, keep refining until like that product that they're building is really amazing. That's the skill set that I think this world needs right now. And that is also going to help make the average higher too, because models are going to learn that and so on and so forth, and kind of we progress as society, right? But so I think is the job of a designer going to change? Yes, but like the core skill sets of like what made a great designer great doesn't change.
Would you encapsulate that X factor as like taste, essentially?
I think taste is one manifestation of it, and I know taste is a very like obfuscated concept, right? It's like, what is taste? Do you have it or do you not? And I think my perspective on it is that yes, like taste is really important, but taste, at the heart of taste, is a few things. It's a point of view, right? And it's also obsession. This idea that like you're gonna keep obsessing over something until it looks just right, feels just right, and like the people who are able to do that, they're the ones who are able to command that taste and really hold that bar.
I love that. Okay, I have one final question on this topic. So, looking ahead, what excites you most about this whole evolving landscape in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning and excited about that next chapter?
Yeah. Well, I think that like, right now we're seeing this huge compression of the product development lifecycle, right? You can go from an idea to a product, you can go to an idea to prototype really, really quickly. And I actually think that will keep compressing more and more. And so people can explore ideas more freely. As part of that, bring more people into the process of building. I think that's a really wonderful thing that everyone can, we've effectively, we like to talk about lowering the floor and raising the ceiling, and that is exactly what AI is doing and what AI is doing in the design space in particular. So I'm, super excited about that. And then, as it relates to kind of the intersection of, AI, data, design, I think that's really interesting too. I think about kind of like futures like, what if as you're designing, you can already know how your design is going to perform based on past data? Or what if you could be running a synthetic A/B test in the background so that you get results on that so you can discard the ideas that won't work? Like that's another compression of the product development lifecycle that's going to be really amazing. I think the other thing that's really interesting for me is like about design and interfaces. I think Sarah might have mentioned this really briefly before, but like when you look at the landscape of products out there, AI products, they kind of look the same, right? Like you've slapped a chat interface on top of your product. And I think, first of all, it makes sense why that was the case, because it's really easy to do that without deeply disrupting the information architecture of your product. And also, the interaction paradigm is appropriate for where AI is at, because AI is slow. And so, if you're chatting with it, the fact that it takes them a while to think almost feels natural, right?
That's interesting.
But like in a world where that becomes faster, maybe things are happening on device, that opens up a whole new landscape of interfaces and design paradigms. Dylan likes to talk about how we're still in the MS-DOS era of AI, and I really, at least from an interface perspective, I agree with that. So I'm really excited to see kind of, AI native products and interfaces and how that evolves as well.
That's awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, Yuki, for taking the time today, and I think we're ready to take a break now.
Thank you.